Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to the HBES Virtual Roundtable series. I'm Paul Dortman. I'm a graduate student at Boston College, and I'm one of the organizers of the series, along with Courtney Crosby at the University of Texas, Austin, and Christopher Smith at the University of Pennsylvania. So before we start, we'd again like to thank Corinne Apicella, Chris Von Ruden, and student representative Kari Pick for proposing the series, as well as the Executive Council of HBES for their support, and Communications Officer Nicole Barbaro and Webmaster Bernard Fink for their help marketing the series. Because this is an HBES-sponsored meeting, please note that the meeting is subject to the HBES Code of Conduct, which I shared in the chat earlier. Just in general, we ask that people try to behave respectfully and professionally to one another during the event, and anyone who violates the Code of Conduct may be removed from the session. We'd also really like to encourage audience participation throughout the event. So if you have a question, please use the Ask Question button in the bottom right of the screen, and please try to keep your questions just to a sentence or two. And also, please feel free to upvote questions asked by other audience members that you would like to see answered. That way, the question will kind of jump up to the top of the list. And finally, everything is being recorded today and will be posted publicly to YouTube after the event. So without further ado, today's discussion will be on the origins of political orientation and partisanship, which I think is a very timely topic. And moderating our event today is Dr. Andy Delton. Andy is an associate professor of political science at Stony Brook University, and is a research affiliate at Stony Brook's Center for Behavioral Political Economy. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn things over to Andy.
Hi, everyone. Delighted to be here today. We've got really a murderer's row of all-stars to talk to us. I see my job is mostly just staying out of the way. I'm going to start by throwing it to each of our individual speakers and asking them to introduce themselves. So let me start with Rose McDermott.
Sorry about that.
I can't unmute. Oh, okay. I wasn't able to unmute. Sorry about that. My name is Rose McDermott. I'm a professor of political science at Brown University, and also a sort of alumni of the Center for Evolutionary Psychology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where I hung out with Lita Cosmides and John Tooby. Thanks. That's where I know Andy from.
Hi, Rose. Good to see you. Next, I'll throw it to John Jost.
Hi, everybody. My name's John Jost. I am a professor at New York University, NYU, in psychology, politics, and data science. And right now, I am somewhere in Pennsylvania.
Undisclosed location.
Exactly.
Next up, Hugo Mercier.
Hi, so I'm Hugo Mercier. I'm a cognitive scientist working at the CNRS in the Institut Jean-Nicot in Paris, and I live in Nantes, also undisclosed address, but in Nantes.
Great. And then finally, Michael Bang Petersen.
Hi all, my name is Michael Bang Petersen. I'm a professor of political science, doing work on the evolutionary psychology of politics, especially these days, misinformation, online hate, and disease prevention.
Awesome. All right. Thank the four of you very much for coming today. So one of the things, we're going to do a couple things in this. First, I've got some kind of general questions that are really just here to kickstart conversation between the four of you. We're going to do that for about half an hour, and then for another half hour, we'll be taking questions from the audience. So my first question for you all is, what is politics to the evolved mind? Is it simply the psychology of groups and morality, or is there something that in some interesting sense is unique and special to politics above and beyond group psychology or moral psychology? Michael, want to jump in?
I can try to go first. So to me, politics is a phenomenon that is intrinsically linked to being a group living species, such as our species. And politics is really about negotiating the distribution of resources within a group. And there's a whole range of different psychological adaptations that are involved in that. Some of them are group-related, some of them are related to morality, but it is really the whole suite of mechanisms related to how should we divide resources between different organisms.
Oh, Rose, remember to unmute yourself. There you
go. Am I unmuted? Yeah, okay. I agree with what Michael said completely, but I would add some pieces to it. So I think it's a lot about resource allocation and distribution, as he said, but I'd add a couple pieces. I think it's also a lot, and I'm going to say this, you know, as the female in the crowd, it's also a lot about negotiating sexual reproduction and the morality around negotiations around childbearing and pregnancy and mating. And so I do think a lot of it is not just about my own choices about that, but how I may or may not want to police your choices around it. And so I think that that's a second really important piece. And the third really important piece for me is really about in-group, out-group behavior. So it's about protecting the in-group, whether that's internally, like issues like immigration, or war and conflict, protecting against predators. So it is about group, but I think there's also a dyadic element that has to do with issues like mating, issues like affiliation, but also how we police that among ourselves and with each other.
I think that's right. I think it's about collective decision-making in general, and that can apply to many, many domains, just about any domain that is relevant for human collective living. And presumably everything about our behavior and our makeup is going to play out in some way in the political sphere. So I wouldn't set aside the domain of politics as sort of qualitatively different from other aspects of human social existence, but it's part of it, and at times it's an official part of it in terms of governments and things like that, but it also has lots of informal aspects as well.
Hugo, any additional thoughts on this?
No, I'm okay, thanks. I think that they've covered everything. Thanks.
All right. Well, so we got pretty wide agreement on that question. Let me switch to a different question that maybe there won't be as much agreement on. So, why does fake news spread? John.
Well, in some ways, Michael and I are working on this and related questions together. He's got a center in Denmark for he can tell us about, but online political hostility, broadly construed, which includes spreading of misinformation and so on. I find it useful to, whenever I think about politics or political psychology or political behavior, to think about sort of top-down social influences, including the influences of organizations, corporations, governments, etc., as well. So I think of that as sort of the top-down set of forces, and that includes elite communication, media, etc., various collective actors who are good faith actors and bad faith actors, and then also bottom-up factors about human psychology. And the way I think about it, these things are meeting somewhere in the middle. And I sometimes use the metaphor from Goethe of elective affinities, that there's a way in which there's a kind of reciprocal attraction between ideas and people. And so, so certain kinds of ideas, including false ideas, I think, are appealing to people for psychological reasons. And the people who are in the information production and dissemination business are aware of that as well, and construct messages that are more likely to be spread and go viral and so on. So if you don't like the literary metaphor from Goethe, who actually, it also influenced the writings of Max Weber a lot, elective affinities from the chemistry domain originally. You could think of it as a market, to be more practical about it. There's a market I think there's a market for misinformation, for fake news. There are actors who are benefiting from its spread one way or another, whether they're foreign governments or people doing it for profit. And there are people who are, for psychological reasons and among other reasons, are susceptible to it and are interested in it and are spreading it themselves. So I think there's a market for fake news.
Michael.
Yeah, so I agree with what John is saying. I think what is important is to differentiate between two different overarching theories of why there is this market, and one line of theory is that it's because people are ignorant. Basically, they want to share the truth, but they are not able to tell right from wrong, and I find that there is some evidence that that is the case, but overall I find that implausible as a general theory of why it is that fake news are spread. I think what is really the way that people access information is not about its veracity, in this case at least, but its usefulness in intergroup conflicts. Fake news is essentially spread as a way to mobilize your group against the other group, and that's why we are seeing that it's so widespread in the context of polarized societies, whether it is polarized on the basis of partisanship, as for example contemporary United States, or whether it is polarized on the basis of ethnic cleavages, as we have seen in other countries around the world. So yes, so my 5 cents is that it is attempts to mobilize the in-group against the out-group.
Hugo, we haven't heard from you yet.
Thanks. Yeah. So I think fake news is a very, very diverse phenomenon. And for instance, I think in 2017 the top fake news on Facebook was babysitter puts baby in her vagina, which might not have served a huge political role. Obviously, the fake news we worry about the most are the ones about Trump and the elections and these sort of things. But it is a very diverse phenomenon, and as Michael was saying, politics is probably one of the reasons why we might be sharing fake news as a way of justifying our political choices and potentially signaling our commitment to our political coalition. As John was saying, there are a number of other reasons why we might find these stories titillating, amusing, or anything else. But in that context, what's amazing is not that fake news are shared because they can have whatever trait we want them to have, given that they're not bound by reality. What's amazing is that they're not shared. Essentially, there are no fake news around at all. It's like 1% of people's news diet is fake news, and that's even really considering the fact that even this 1% is mostly 80% of that 1% is the vast majority of that 1% is consumed by a very, very small number of people. So the vast majority of people never encounter any fake news. And so what's amazing is why we don't see more fake news, given how appealing they are. And I think there are two reasons. One is that most people are actually not that bad at discriminating fake news from true news. And the other is that we punish reputationally people or institutions that share fake news. And so we lower the trust we have in them very quickly. And that's why mainstream media essentially don't share fake news by the standard definition, and why academics don't do it. Most people actually never share fake news.
Rose, did you have some? Do you want to jump in with anything? Oh, we got your mic turned off. There we go. Oh, I think you and the organizer may be trying to mess with it at the same time.
Goes off.
What the heck? There we go.
Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I agree with everything that people have said, and I especially think that Michael's been doing a lot of really interesting and important work. I just add a couple of quick things. One is I think that one of the functions this serves, in addition to the in-group, out-group signaling that Michael identifies, is it also for a lot of people, it serves to reduce uncertainty, right? And uncertainty is uncomfortable. And so having a simple, not cognitively demanding way of thinking about the world is an efficient use of our cognitive resources. And so in many ways, it's easier to, just have a simple solution rather than a complex series of, very abstract notions. And certainly repetition is part of that. And I just note that it's not accidental which ideas become viral and which ones don't. And Dan and Chip Heath have some really interesting work on ideas that stick and which ones are much more likely to go viral. And I think it's important to realize that the ones that are like that aren't just simple, but they're emotional in content, and that speaks to this social aspect of coalition that Michael identified at the beginning. And I think that that's worth considering as part of the larger discussion as well.
Great, thank you, everyone. Actually, sorry, feedback for Hugo. Can I ask a follow-up on your view? So you were arguing that there's essentially very little fake news out there. People are consuming very little. It's not being spread that much. So why is everyone so obsessed with fake news then? So as a kind of a meta thing, not obsessed with sharing it, obsessed with stopping it.
That's a very good question, and there are many reasons why misinformation spreads so well. One of them is that it is in the interest, to some extent, of mainstream media to kind of cast aspersions on the social media that are now one of their largest competitors. And we've already seen that, for instance, when radio started threatening newspapers, the newspapers were also saying that radio is going to turn people into sheep and make them stupid and allow the diffusion of any kind of fake news, like in the the War of the World broadcast. So that's one reason. The other is that people are always sensitive to kind of threatening information that make us potentially vulnerable. And another one, and there's a number of them, is that it provides maybe a reassuring, somewhat really reassuring explanation for why so many people seem to disagree with us so strongly. So we know that in the US, for instance, people have widely misguided views of the other parties, and like Republicans will think like a third of Democrats are homosexuals, and Democrats will think that all Republicans are for the death penalty or something. So if you think the other party is just consistently wrong and consistently has abhorrent views on many things, instead of thinking that half of Americans are just completely morally bankrupt, you'd rather think, well, actually they've all been brainwashed by fake news and by Fox News or MSNBC. So it might provide actually some reassurance given the misguided views people have of other parties in the first place.
Any of our other speakers interested in a response to that? Michael?
Yeah, I just so I agree with the points that Hugo made. I just want to make a sort of more general point about the sort of lack of widespread sharing of fake news, which I completely agree with. And I think one of the reasons is that that often voters or individuals don't need to actually go to the fake news sources in order to find useful information for these mobilization purposes. So one of the things that we've been working on and are trying to get out right now is to look at ideological asymmetries in fake news sharings between Democrats and Republicans. And one of the interesting things that we're finding is that Republicans, they do seem to be sharing more fake news stories, or at least link more to fake news websites than Democrats. But the point that we're trying to make is that the reason for that is that Democrats can go to more mainstream sites and find stories that are highly critical of Republicans, so they don't need to go to the fringe sites to find the kind of ammunition that they are using. So essentially, if you can find good ammunition in the mainstream, then you just go there.
Rose.
Like, if you actually separate out the Republicans in your sample do you notice people sharing more or less, or in the Democrats, by education? I just ask because the voting now in the U.S. appears split more by education in this last election than it was by race, right? So have you looked at that?
So we're looking at different measures of sort of digital literacy, cognitive reflection, and so on. And here, our findings is different from the findings of, for example, David Rand. So we're not finding much effects on cognitive reflection or digital literacy. So those kinds of measures have a huge effect on whether you believe or whether you can spot fake news or not. But it doesn't really matter for sharing, because according to my sense, it's driven by a different set of psychological motivations than belief.
Yeah, it seems clear that people that there are individual and probably group differences in how willing people are to share things that they think might not be true or even know are not true, and that's part of what's going on. So we shouldn't conflate the spreading of misinformation necessarily with false belief, and yet, and also it's true that probably most of the sharing of truly false news or conspiratorial things is done by a relatively small proportion of users, and yet there are widespread false beliefs in public opinion studies. So that has to be explained one way or another. Ultimately, that's where I think ideology plays a role, in that some ideologies, just on a purely logical basis, have to be more accurate and closer to the truth than others. So you can get pretty far by saying it's in-group, out-group, and especially if you incorporate things like the Russians trying to mess up the in-group, out-group dynamics in our democracy, which is already more than in-group, out-group, but it's another factor. But you can't get all the way there if you really want to understand false beliefs in the political sphere. I think at some point you need to face up to the fact that there's different software that different groups are running, different ideologies. Even if the hardware is more or less the same, there's a lot of different software out there.
All right, why don't we do one last general question to the group before we move to audience questions. So the left-right dimension in politics, is this in some interesting sense a feature of human nature, or at least almost certain to come about based on the way human sociality works? Or is this just some sort of quirk of modern societies that everywhere we look, there seems to be, if not the only, at least a major dimension, the left-right dimension in politics? Oh, John, your mic is still off.
Well, since I'm writing a book on the subject, I guess I have to say something about that. Well, first, the concept of human nature is one that bedevils me a bit, and I've wrestled with it. And obviously, I believe in biological evolution and I believe in cultural evolution, but I'm not sure a concept like human nature is particularly useful. And I don't think evolutionary biologists really use it as an explanatory construct when they're trying to understand other species. They don't really talk about the prairie vole nature versus, or the arachnid nature or something like that. So I think it's fundamentally not really a helpful scientific construct to talk about it that way, insofar as one means something essentialistic about the biological or other limitations of the species, or what we're confined to by virtue of our genetic inheritance. It seems to me that that's not a good way to think about it. What is a good way to think about it, obviously, is that everything in human behavior, in the social world, in the political world, is obviously an interaction between our biological endowments and our cultural inheritance. And so we need to understand that. And so as a historical question, left and right, we know, goes back to the French Revolution. where it literally referred to where people sat in the French Parliament at the time of the 1789 French Revolution. And the people on the right were in favor of the status quo, the ancient regime, the church, the crown, the aristocracy. They wanted to keep things as they were. The people on the left were sympathetic to the revolutionaries. And so as a direct historical question, left and right goes back at least to 1789, the French Revolution. There are people who think it goes back further. In the Bible, there's comments about the right hand of God and so on. There are interesting things about handedness that go back in Indo-European culture that we can talk about, and maybe they provided some basis for a kind of spatial metaphor. Most people are right-handed. That's the dominant majority. The left-handers are therefore the underdogs. Maybe that's not an accident. Maybe it is. I don't know. There's words in Latin and other Latin languages, sinister. The left is sinister. The right in various languages, including French, is rights of the majority, and so on. So anyway, these are interesting things to ponder. But what it seems to me is, rather than constructed in human nature per se, it's a fact of social life that we, living collectively as we do, we need to make certain decisions collectively. And as I said, this is what politics is all about. And those decisions will have certain characteristics across culture, across time and place. And one of the things that I think every group or every culture, every social entity has to deal with is, how much do we continue doing what the people who went before us did? How much do we stick with tradition? How much do we stick with the status quo? How much versus how much do we try to do something better? Do we improve upon it? Do we look for change, progress? Are we open to that? Or are we experiencing that as a violation? And so I think there's a fundamental, for me, left and right is a social construction that has two major axes, at least two major axes. The two major axes that I think are most apparent. And again, these are things that I think are going to be relevant throughout human history as we know it, as we've understood it to be. One is openness to change and progress versus the maintenance of tradition. And the second is hierarchy versus equality. And they go together because in Western society, we've been for centuries moving. Progress has been considered to be the thing that gives more political equality, more voting rights and other rights, more economic equality, more social equality, treating people of different races, ethnic groups, genders more equally. This has been historically confounded with progress versus tradition. And so the people, and this goes back to the French Revolution too, like Edmund Burke, who are resisting the French Revolution that calls for equality on social, economic, political grounds, resisting that in favor of social stability, social order, tradition, etc. I think this is going to be a fundamental quandary for virtually all human cultural groups. Do we stick with what's worked for us in the past, or do we try to come up with something that is better and fairer, that is more equal?
Great, thanks so much, John. I really appreciate the answer. Thanks, Michael. You wanted to jump in?
Yeah. So I think I disagree with John about the usefulness of the concept of human nature, but that's a separate thing. I think I do agree with the overall notion of how you, John, perceive ideology, that it's not something that's sort of ingrained in us. So the way that I would phrase it, which I think is compatible with what you're saying, is that basically humans are trying to, in politics, humans are trying to pursue their interests, and those interests, they are multidimensional. There are a large range of ways in which we all differ. But a central tool that we have available for getting those interests through is by forming coalitions. and essentially ideologies emerge from the formation of coalitions between individuals who have sort of close enough interests that it makes sense for them to cooperate. So I sacrifice some of my interest to be part of a coalition, which means that I will for sure get some of my interest through. And I think that's the underlying sort of social dynamics underlying ideologies.
Yeah, I think that I agree with a lot of that, but I'm not sure it accounts for every case of an ideology. For example, I saw someone saying the people who are benefit always want to keep the way things are. There's certainly some truth to that, but I'm a white man who, you know, would have been doing great if we had stuck with the way things were in the last century, and yet that's not what I believe. So once the ideologies are created, they can be spread and people can be attracted to them, even if it's not in their own narrow self-interest or their own group interest, because it appeals to things for reasons that are social and psychological and so on. I don't want to make something mystical out of it. But the ideologies, once they exist, they're external to even the group that invented it. And they can appeal to other people because of those people's needs, interests, concerns, wishes, desires, motives, etc.
And Rose, you wanted, oh, actually, and before you start talking, Rose, let me say we're going to be going to audience questions soon. So if you have questions, please ask them. And I'll tend to favor questions that move us on to additional topics beyond the ones we've already been discussing. Okay, Rose.
Yeah, I don't want to keep it from questions, so I'll keep this short. But I do think that there is a genetic instantiation to some aspects of ideology. So I agree with John that the most important question is the question about interaction, right? You know, interaction between biological instantiation and cultural and environmental inputs. I agree with that. But in a lot of the genetic work that I've done with Pete Hitami, looking at large populations across, you know, decades and 5 different continents, you really do see systematic contributions. It's not 100%, not even close, but certainly up to half of the variants being attributed to heritable aspects when you look at ideology as broadly construed right and left. So here I'm not talking about Republican and Democrat within the constraint of liberal American democracy, but more like think about communism versus fascism, right? And a big part of that, as Michael said earlier, is about resource distribution. There's other pieces that are about sex. There's other pieces that are about in-group, out-group behavior. But I do think there is part of that that is instantiated. I think that the way that that's important is that it then can work as a sort of background operating system, psychological mechanism through which attention is directed, information is processed. There's a lot of downstream consequences of that programming. And it is exquisitely sensitive to environmental input, right? I'm not saying that the environment is irrelevant. And I absolutely think it serves the purposes that Michael was discussing, but I would lean more towards saying that there's more of a biological contribution, or at least genetic heritable contribution to ideological processing than you know, have been raised by John earlier.
Well, I just want to say I agree with that. I've been very influenced by your work and other people's work in this regard, and I accept the estimate that approximately 40% of left-right political orientation seems to be genetically heritable. In your estimates, it's 20% shared environmental variance and 40% unique environmental variance based on twin studies and so on. Yeah, I totally accept that. The only thing I would say is the mediator is psychology. And so it's the psychological characteristics and traits that are genetically heritable, have a genetically heritable component to them. And that makes people, if they're exposed to it, this is why I don't consider it really programming exactly so much as a predilection or the demand side of things, that people are prone to gravitate towards certain political ideas if they're exposed to them in their environment. So you need to be shown the ideological menu in order to know where your needs are going to be satisfied. And so that's back to either the elective affinities metaphor or the market metaphor or whatever. There are inputs that are about the genetic basis, that include the genetic basis of individual differences, in my view. But it's ultimately an interaction. If you grew up in a place where it's a totalitarian society and there is no ideological menu, then the genetics are not going to probably predict anything about your political attitudes.
Right, and the one piece I'd add to that, oh, sorry, and then I'll go to Hugo, but the one piece I'd just add to that is I do think that there is some part of the genetic contribution that also predicts self-selecting into environments that expose you into certain things or not, whether that's around openness or around other, psychological characteristics. I think that now, as you say, if you're in a totalitarian society, you may not ever be exposed to that, but in a free market of ideas, certain people are going to, for other psychological heritable aspects, self-select into certain environments, even if those are social environments, even if they're driven by social characteristics, not political characteristics, be exposed to certain ideas rather than others. And so there's a feedback loop of endogeneity there.
Totally agree.
Hugo, you wanted to jump in.
Yes, if it lets me.
There we go.
Yes, sorry. No.
No, you're good.
Yes. So thank you. Yeah. Not much. So what I'm going to say is not for the panel there, but for the audience members. I think it's easy to, when we think of this kind of left-right thing to have like a prototypical Democrat and a prototypical Republican in mind, people who are really interested in politics and whose opinions are very consistently on the right or consistently on the left. And essentially, apart from the people we know, these people don't exist. So most people don't care about politics. Like the abstention rate in the like this hugely kind of massive election last month was like 40%. And even of the 60% who voted, most of them care about politics once every 4 years for like a couple of days. So most people know absolutely nothing about politics. They don't know where any party stands on anything. And most people's views are completely incoherent. They're all over the place. So this is kind of changing. People are becoming more informed, at least in the US, and their views are becoming a bit more consistent. But this is very much the exception rather than the rule. So I think it's just
I'm going to totally disagree with that. I've written papers arguing against Converse 1962 line on this. Converse was brilliant, and it was a very important argument, and I'm glad we've had it. But it's been misconstrued and misused to suggest that people don't care about politics. And I just don't think that's true. 150 million Americans turned out, some of them foaming at the mouth, to vote in our most recent election. People are not indifferent to politics. I can't even walk down the street here without tripping over signs or getting into conversations that are dangerous and full of landmines. Of course, you're right that people are not super knowledgeable. They're definitely not political scientists. They get a lot of things wrong. And some of the things they get wrong because of politics, because of ideology, because they're tuning into Fox News or Breitbart or wherever, and they're being influenced. But they're tuning in because they have a political demand there, in an ideological demand. There are some reasons why people vote for Trump or support Trump that may not be very ideological, but there's lots of reasons why what he says resonates with them on a deep level. And a lot of what he's saying is frankly ideological, whether they realize it or not.
All right. I do want to get to some audience questions. Michael, I saw you had your finger up. Is there a very short point you want to make?
Yeah, I just want to say that I think it's possible to agree both with Hugo and John, or maybe disagree with them both. I don't know. So I think basically we are these political animals who are not necessarily interested in politics. Like we have the psychological mechanisms that we have for politics were designed for a small scale world, which means that they are often not triggered in the context of modern politics. Sometimes they are very much triggered in like a polarized America, but often they are not. So I really think it depends on what are the specific cues available to this political animal before our political interest is activated in modern society. And now I'll shut up.
Great. Okay. So we got a lot of interesting questions, but many questions follow on topics we've been discussing at length. So I'm going to go with, to start off at least, with a question by Chris von Ruden. And essentially the question is, how does politics differ for men versus women? Is there a reason, especially from the evolutionary perspective, to see politics as being different interests or different tactics that men and women use? Rose.
There
we go. Oh, shoot.
Can't get it to, okay. Is that going to hold?
No, you're good. Oh, no.
Go.
Oh.
I don't know that this, okay. So I love Chris's question because I sort of feel like it's my life's work. So my first response is, how isn't it different? And a lot of that is being driven by reproductive imperatives. So the ways in which the differential costs of childbearing and child rearing come down to men and women also, I think, instantiate a set of psychological motives and preferences that differ. It doesn't mean that there isn't huge variance within women and huge variance within men, and that there isn't overlapping interests between men and women. There are. But I think that they're driven by vastly different investment in parental investment. And that has downstream consequences that look like they're not necessarily about reproduction, but can be. And I think that that plays out in politics, particularly in areas like Michael has talked about with resource distribution. If you need 10,000 calories a day while you're pregnant and you're too big to be able to go out and get those 10,000 calories, you have to have someone else get it for you. And, you know, if you're in Denmark, that can be the state, but the state is a relatively recent invention. And so historically, that's going to have to be men in your life or female coalitions, which are usually, you know, a mother, a daughter, a sister, you know, some kind of female kin. And so the resources you need and your ability to get those resources are diminished in states of pregnancies in ways that there's no real analog to men. And so I think that that has a whole bunch of consequences for how people think about vulnerability, for how they think about what needs they have and who needs to provide that, and what happens when you're not able to meet those needs yourself. And, you know, I can go on about that, but I'll stop there.
Thanks, Rose. Anyone else want to jump in on this question? All right. So one question that kind of popped up in a couple different ways in the comments is in kind of the war of information. So, for instance, Michael outlined two sort of different theories about either people are just not good at evaluating information, that's why fake news spreads, or they're kind of rallying cries. So people, like if my group has done something bad to your group, even if I haven't actually done something bad, if you tell everyone else, you can all band together against me. But several people have asked questions around kind of a third possible theory that has to do with essentially beliefs that are extremely bizarre or counterintuitive, may be in some way like a costly signal or something along those lines, a marker of group identity. So if anyone wants to jump in on what either the possibility or the evidence for that. So Hugo.
Yes, that's a fascinating possibility. The idea behind it is that you know, if you want to join a coalition that brings you some benefits, people who are already in the coalition have an incentive to make sure that you're not going to be you know, to be crunching of their resources and to be freeloading, and so they want to make sure that you're committed to the coalition. And unfortunately, saying things like, you know, oh, I love you guys, you know, I think you have it's a really great coalition you've got there, you know, I'd love to join, is intrinsically cheap, and so there is no strong reason to believe these kind of signals on their own. By contrast, if you start insulting everybody else and having ideas that everybody else will think are either morally bankrupt or pretty silly, then you've honestly signaled that you can't join any other coalition, and therefore that you know, that coalition that you want to join is the other choice you have, is the only choice you have, and that you know, as a result, they can believe you when you say that you're committed to them. So I don't know that I think it's a very kind of interesting hypothesis. I'm not sure that there's a lot of evidence for it. One bit of it is that I'm not saying there's any kind of evidence against it either. I'm just saying it's not something people have investigated all that much. One bit that's relevant is that we know that people who are ostracized, for instance, either who have been ostracized or experimentally are meant to feel ostracized, tend to develop more extreme views. And so that's something that kind of fits well with that theory. But there are many predictions from that theory that haven't been fully explored. I mean, one of them that we know a bit about is that most of these extreme beliefs, if this theory of kind of signaling theory is correct, most of these extreme and absurd beliefs should not have behavioral consequences, because their point isn't, as most beliefs, to be a representation of the world that guides our behavior. Instead, their point is signaling. And indeed, we see on the whole that most of these extreme beliefs have no actual consequences. Like, people don't act on their basis at all, fortunately. So that also kind of supports that view. But it's really something that deserves to be investigated much more fully.
Michael, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah. So Hugo has said it all, I think, but I just want to sort of add a slight little thing to where he ended, and that's often there's a lack of behavioral consequences of these fringe beliefs, and that means that it might not be accurate to think about it as costly signaling. Because it's not that you take on a cost necessarily by believing this weird belief. It's more that it's the complexity of the belief that signals that you are embedded in a particular group, and that you have been embedded in the group for a very long time. The way that you are able to work with very, very weird beliefs. So the one sort of standard example from Pascal Boyer is that this idea of God being both one and three persons at the same time, which is very, very weird if you are not sort of grown up in a Christian household, and then you can sort of work with it and play with it and talk about it as if it makes obvious sense. So I think it's not a costly signal as much as it's a signal of an that you are embedded in a particular group.
Rose, did you want to say something, or no?
No, I just can't make the toggle work for me.
Okay, so that's sorry. So I think Michael, both are plausible hypotheses, but the one I had in mind and the one that I thought the questions were referring to is the idea of having beliefs that are so extreme that they really can burn your bridges with other coalitions, which is indeed costly. So if I say on social media that I believe all Democrats are Satan worshipping pedophiles, it is costly, because many people aren't going to be my friends, they're not going to want to hire me, etc., etc. So there is in that case a genuine cost, not because you act on your beliefs like that guy who stormed that pizzeria in which they were supposed to be abusing children, in which case you pay that the higher cost. But there is a reputational cost that might be quite genuine. But even that remains to be investigated, although intuitively it feels right.
Yeah, that's a good point.
John or Rose, any quick thoughts on this one?
I think that's right. I don't have any real disagreements with anything that's been said, as long as we keep in mind that those are necessary but not sufficient conditions for the existence of a specific ideology or belief system. That is, these are general explanations for why groups would come up with belief systems, but it really doesn't speak to the issue of what's in the contents of the belief systems. And that's something that I think as social scientists we also need to attend to and pay attention to the fact that even if for many people they have no real behavioral consequences, for some people they do, and they will. And those consequences can be quite extreme when they, for instance, are used to justify violence against other people and so on.
All right, let me turn to another question. One of the most upvoted questions in our list. This goes back to our discussions about partisanship and ideology. So Pat Barclay asks, essentially, in our right versus left discussions, typically we think of people on the right as supporting more in favor of, say, capitalism or free markets. People on the left in favor of, if anyone is in favor of non-capitalist things, they tend to come from the left. But if you had a society like a traditionally communist society, then would it be the right conservatives, the right-wing conservatives, who are then also the ones in favor of sticking with communism? And it's the progressives who want radically open markets, radically free markets. So, John, this might be best thrown to you first, at least.
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. I think, yes, if we're willing to move in away from the realm of left and right or liberalism, conservatism in politics or in political philosophy and into the realm of psychology, and we're talking about psychological conservatism now, then yes, absolutely. That's why I sometimes find it more useful to talk about system justification, ideologies that justify the existing status quo, whatever they are. And there was plenty of system justification under communism in the Soviet Union, ideologies, belief systems that legitimized and justified the way things were done under the regime. And so the people who were staunch defenders of communism in the 1970s and 1980s, I think psychologically they would have a lot in common with people who are free market fundamentalists in the United States, maybe other Western capitalist countries. And in fact, there is some research by Peter Beatty in China now that is starting to show some of this, that people who are in mainland China, people who are really defenders of the Chinese status quo, they seem to have many of the psychological characteristics that my colleagues and I have found with regard to conservatives in the United States, including intolerance of ambiguity, needs to reduce uncertainty, threat, conformity, etc.
Any thoughts by the other panelists? All right, well, let me turn actually to a question that just popped up. This is from Chris Smith. He asked, can our panelists speculate on features of our psychology, our evolved political psychology, that might be exploited to improve democratic institutions? Or one features of our psychology that clash with democratic institutions and might reduce their effectiveness? Hugo.
I mean, yeah, we could talk about that for hours and hours and hours. So the thing I've been working on the most is reasoning and argumentation, and I've got quite a bit of work reviewing other work and my own work showing that people are actually pretty good at reasoning and arguing in groups. And so if you take a small group of people and they have some common or incentives, they're not like poker players. They're actually going to do a very good job at figuring things out together, at coming to a broadly accurate view, assuming what at least some of the members have an accurate view to start with. And so one of the ways in which this is being used in politics is by building deliberative democracy, in which you try to create institutions in which citizens talk with each other, and on the whole, the empirical results seem to be pretty positive. So that's one example of how you can try to use a psychological trait for the best, and especially because the same reasoning abilities, when you're using them on your own, might or with people who just agree with you, might lead to polarization and overconfidence, and things are problematic.
I think Michael, you had your hand up, and then we'll go to Rose.
Yeah, so I just want to say that basically democracy is resting on our evolved nature as a super cooperative species. So in that sense, without those psychological mechanisms, there would be no democracy. The basic idea that we are in it together and that we are trying to that we have long-term joint interests, and because of them, we will sacrifice short-term interests. That is the sort of key foundation for democracy, and that's also why polarization is so dangerous. Is if we're losing this sense of a joint faith, or that there are cooperative surpluses from cooperation to be harvested.
Rose.
Yeah, I'll just add that I'm not overconfident that deliberation necessarily works. Anybody who's been in a faculty meeting knows that talking about things sometimes makes things more polarized rather than less, because it becomes, as Michael has so eloquently stated earlier, a signifier of a particular kind of coalition. And I've seen many, many, many cases where people come into a faculty meeting like this, have a conversation and end up like this. And so I'm not convinced that talking about things necessarily makes it better. Anybody who's been trained in marriage counseling knows it really doesn't work. It doesn't always work.
So maybe we should read John Rawls and put a veil over our faces before we go in so we don't know who's whom.
So the last point sort of, I don't disagree with Michael, but I also think that part of the problem is that our evolved psychology really is working on much smaller groups than modern democracy. And modern democracy requires us to have an expansion of, say 150, 200 people to 330 million people. And the problem is the other mechanisms that would keep it honest and safe, like cheater detection, at 150 is really impossible at 330. And so there's just a lot more room for exploitation. And that exploitation undermines our ability to have faith in those institutions institutionally, and also allows people to exploit those institutions. And so I really don't think it's anywhere near as simple as deliberation or talking. I think that can undermine the kind of rules and procedures we need to do to keep things trustworthy enough to allow them to expand to the enormous size populations that we now have to govern as part of a state.
Hugo, did you want to say anything in rejoinder to what Rose said?
Yeah, no, very quickly. So yes, I mean, there are some conditions have to be met for deliberation to work, and one of them that I mentioned is that there has to be some overarching common incentive, like you're not going to convince another poker player to fold, for instance, if it's not in their interest, and also that people have to have some disagreement, otherwise you have this kind of polarization phenomenon. But on the whole, I think you're unduly pessimistic, and the empirical results that are out there show that even when you take random samples of Americans, you have them talk about policies, they don't grow more polarized. They tend, on the contrary, to converge towards middle ground, and it's been shown in quite a vast number of experiments by now.
Anyone have any final thoughts on this issue? All right. Well, we've hit the 3 o'clock mark, which I think means we're basically out of time. So if any of our panelists have any parting shots they want to fire, feel free to raise your hand and we'll slip those in real quick. All right, well, thank you all very much for giving us your time and your thoughts today. And thanks to those who attended for coming. This was a really interesting discussion. I really appreciate both our speakers and the audience for attending today.
Thanks a lot, indeed. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Hi, everyone. We actually have 15 minutes. The event is scheduled till 3:15. So if you guys have any more concluding thoughts you want to touch on or questions, that'd be great. If not, we can just end here.
I'd love to hear more questions from the audience if we have some.
It seems that they are.
Are they logging? Yeah,
jumping out of the room.
Jumping out, but maybe some are staying. We still have 249 people there. Pretty good showing for an online thing.
Yes, that was very impressive. Yeah.
Andy, I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. There we go. So I guess we have 15 more minutes. My apologies. I thought we ended at 3. So one, a kind of general topic that has come up in several of the questions that have been posed is basically, and this has been touched on a little bit, but essentially the tension between leaders and followers. So if you guys want to free associate on your thoughts about that, feel free to.
Sorry, free associate about what?
Leaders and followers. Tension between leaders and followers. So like one of the questions, let's see, that is how might leaders use versus followers use conspiracy theories in different ways? And if you want to answer that question, feel free. But if you have other burning thoughts on leaders and followers and the tension between the relationship between them, It's both cooperative and conflictual. Feel free to share that as well. Several people have asked about leaders and followers. Michael.
Yeah, I can say a little bit on this. So we've been doing some work on these tensions between leaders and followers. So the basic idea, which is also work by Mark van Vogt and Michael Price, what they're arguing is that there's this sort of service for prestige relationship between leaders and followers. So leaders provide service to the group and get prestige in return. But that means that, so there's a social contract, but the followers need some kinds of tools to constantly monitor whether the leaders are in fact providing the service in exchange for the prestige, and it's pretty difficult to actually do, because there is an information asymmetry between the leaders and the followers. The leaders know often more about what's going on than the followers, and one of the things that I've been arguing together with my collaborator Troels Bergild is that procedural fairness, for example, which is this sort of orientation towards fair procedures, non-partisan decision-making processes, that basically serves as a diagnostic tool to whereby we try to identify exploitive leaders who are taking more prestige for less service. So that's at least one sort of thought on it.
John or Hugo?
I think these are obviously very complicated questions to try to, and very broad ones to try to wrestle with, and important ones. And I liked what Michael was saying before about democratic systems rest upon our capacities as people, and I think that's definitely true. And any basis for optimism and pessimism has to come from those things. But that is, in a way, my problem with the very vague concept of human nature, that because it's clearly in our capacity to be cooperative, but also to be competitive, to be generous and kind, and to be ruthless and awful, and all these things are within us. So it just seems to me that what we want to do is figure out the situational and other triggers that are more likely to elicit the kinds of behaviors that we want, and to build our institutions so that they will call those kinds of behaviors out, and not so much the uglier stuff. So I guess that is the basis for optimism and pessimism. But on the follower leader question, unfortunately, I do think we do have these capacities for real cruelty, and that leaders who are I don't know how we want to characterize them, but are less than concerned with the welfare of all, or even many, who are able to exploit those tendencies in people. And I think clearly that's what we have to watch out for, is that kind of demagoguery, and to try to create institutions that have breaks on that. And so that's got to be also part of our cultural evolution, that we need institutions that, again, are capable of eliciting the stuff we want, and discouraging the stuff that we don't want. Because unfortunately, I do think it's not that hard for a leader to take things in a pretty awful direction, as my own opinion, as we've seen in recent years.
Hugo, anything you wanted to add to this? Then let me ask one of our most upvoted questions. Do or can any non-human animals have fake news? Michael.
Yes, they can, for sure. Like there's a lot of at least anecdotal evidence of manipulation in non-human primates, where so there's this particular anecdote. I think it's Frans de Waal about, well, I can't remember the specific species, but an infant is watching an older male or maybe an older female digging up some root that it wants, and then it cries out as if it has been attacked, which means that the mother comes and chases off the male or female, whatever it was, and then the infant eats whatever food. And I think there are lots of these sort of, at least at the anecdotal level, of social manipulation through information. And I think that's basically fake news.
Yeah, I clearly there are forms of deception in the animal kingdom, but I'm curious whether Michael or other people think that other animals, other species could have ideologies or something like a proto-ideology, a belief system that serves functions that ideologies serve.
Well, there's some research on animal personality, which could be sort of the equivalent of some of this, but I don't know that literature well enough to say anything clever, or even not so clever.
Instead of from the Michael, let me probe you a little bit. Instead of taking it from the official questions list, let me borrow from the comment thread question in response to you from Michael Barlev. So your discussion of that primate example, is that fake news or just deception? And if fake news is just deception, then is fake news, what is that all we mean by fake news, or is fake news something special?
So that's a very good question. So I think fake, well, if we look at the term itself, then fake news is a specific word that is used to decrease trust in mainstream media institutions. Like that's the origin of the fake news word. So the way that it is since been used is as an example of or a description of things that are false. So it's information that is false, essentially, and deception is, I guess, an attempt to convey false information as if it was accurate.
So Hugo, I saw you shaking your head there for a second.
Yeah, if I may just so I guess fake news is typically defined as information that is false, but that kind of masquerades as being true, and that mostly by using the templates and the codes of typical kind of standard mainstream journalism. That's one of the reasons why it's been kind of a godsend to psychologists, because it makes it very easy to study. Like it's like something that's just completely fabricated, and that just looks like a normal newspaper article. But these obviously, as I was pointing out, are extremely rare. And the vast majority of problematic communication is much more subtle. It's going to be biased, it's going to be lying only on one point, but the rest is going to be true. And that's much harder to study, that is more prevalent. And that's also, that's also where you can find blending in with more common forms of deceptions that you will also find in animals. So you won't have fake news with this very exacting definition. You won't find that in animals, obviously, because they don't have journals and newspapers. But you'll find other forms of deceptions, as Michael was saying. And just one small point is that there's a deeper reason, I guess, why fake news are such a very rare phenomenon, and why deception as a whole remains relatively rare. And that's a very kind of basic result in the evolution of communication, that for any communication system to be evolutionarily stable, it has to benefit on average both animals or individuals who send signals and animals or individuals who receive signals. And so if deception was the rule, then the whole communication system would crumble. And you see that, for instance, if you're playing poker with friends, even if you trust them in your life, you can't convince them to fold, because they know it's in that context. Just it makes no sense to do it. So communication can break down very quickly if it's not upheld by a bunch of different mechanisms.
John or Michael, any additional thoughts on this? John, if you're trying to speak, I think your mic is turned off still.
You can't hear me, I think, right?
There you go.
There we go. Okay. Just a clarification, Hugo. that makes sense to me in terms of our evolutionary past, but I would assume that you couldn't be confident in that going forward in any particular given informational environment, or ecology. There could be places in our informational ecology, certain websites or certain social networks where there's much more deception than real information or useful information, right? And it could lead to the downfall of that group or something like that. But certainly, there's the possibility of a deeply problematic information pattern going on that causes harm to people, including the people who are participating in it, right?
Yes, no, it's possible. Yeah, I don't know that there is any kind of society or cultural group in which deception is the rule, or in which deception is not only the rule, but is actually successfully deceptive. But I don't know every human group ever. So,
cool. Thanks.
Okay, unfortunately, our time is now up. But thank you all so much for coming. I again want to thank our moderator and our speakers for this really wonderful discussion. It was super interesting, as well as the Executive Council for their support, and all of you for being here. So our next event will be on teaching and evolution of cumulative culture. That'll take place in January or February, so stay tuned for more information about that session soon. And finally, we welcome feedback from HBES members to improve the event. So if you have any comments, please email them to us. I'm going to share the email address in the chat in a minute. So with that, thank you all so much for coming, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Andy. John, Michael. Cheers, guys.
Yeah, thanks all. Very good seeing you.
Yeah, it was nice, remotely, but still.
Yeah.